All right, good morning, everybody. It's only got about 20 people. Sorry for the late start. I'd like to at least give people an opportunity to join in before we start, but it's 5 after. So I am recording this just so everyone knows. Hope everyone had a good holiday and Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you for all the comments. Do we have anything before we get moving today? All right. I know we have John Borkowski. He's going to be discussing the interconnection work group, and Fred Kelly. Again, I had to push him, or he asked to be pushed back for a few different reasons. So we'll get him on hopefully in February. So with that, I'll turn it over to John. You there, sir?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to take control of the screen here.
All right.
I'll put my presentation up. And by the way, Chuck has this presentation now, so I assume that he'll be sending it to the work group.
Yep. I'll do that right now.
Okay. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here again. If you recall, I was here in November discussing the electrification study and the energy storage program work group. But today, in alignment with your J process map sequencing, I'm here to talk about the interconnection work group and specifically, how some of our work group's objectives overlap with distribution system planning. So you may recall from my November presentation that I had this slide. It's the same slide, our state policy goals. These goals apply to electric distribution system planning from the Climate Solutions Now Act. So without going through each of these policy goals in detail, I did have a matrix that kind of showed the overlap of some of the groups that I'm leading with the distribution system planning work group. So this is virtually the same slide as you saw in November, but since we previously discussed electrification study and energy storage work group, I'm just going to be focusing on the interconnection work group. So basically areas of overlap with distribution system planning and interconnection work group are displayed in the far right column. And I do think that when it comes to energy storage deployment, there's an overlap in that interconnection work group has done some things to make it more flexible to deploy energy storage. Certainly, load flexibility is in scope, mainly, because of energy storage, but also we're going to be starting to look at things like virtual power plants and aggregation of DERs in our phase 6. And when we think of DERs, sometimes people think only of generation, but DERs can also be load curtailment. So when aggregations, DER aggregations sell in dam markets, they can be aggregated both generation resources and load curtailment resources. Certainly, interconnection supports resilience and reliability, the bidirectional grid. Certainly, non-wire solutions have to be interconnected, and we support DER deployment, and also, our group is an open work group. Any stakeholder that desires to be involved can be involved. So that's basically how we map to the state policy goals for distribution system planning. Okay, from an interconnection perspective, and I would say right off the bat that I was around when we first put in the interconnection regs in Maryland, and I had some responsibility at that time when I worked for a utility to help implement the interconnection regulations. And you can see those regs went into effect 2008, 2009 time frame, and you can see since 2010 on this chart when the reporting began. We have had a pretty significant increase in interconnection requests approved and also nameplate capacity approved. Now, some may be questioning, the rapid ramp up, and then you see once we get past 2016, 17, that it seems to be a decline, which really only in 2022 have we approached the level of nameplate capacity approved that we had back in the 2017 timeframe. I really do think that a lot of the reason why we saw the dip is really the incentives out there, particularly SREC values, which if you go to the MEA webpage, you can see some graphs because they track SREC values over time. You can see how they dipped significantly after that 2017 into 18, and that does have an impact on interconnections, because the vast majority of our interconnections are solar interconnections. We do have energy storage interconnections also, but the vast majority are solar interconnections. Now, I want to also caution that these metrics do not reflect interconnections in Maryland that are not under Maryland jurisdiction. We have for transmission interconnections, FERC has jurisdiction, and they have to go into the PJMQ process. If anybody has heard about the problems with the PJMQ, you know that the projects are backlogged in that queue, and that also is affecting ER deployment in Maryland, particularly some large solar and energy storage projects that are stuck in the PJMQs. But we don't have that problem in Maryland. I think if you look at some of the metrics that I've supplied on this slide, in general, I think the utilities are keeping up with the timeframes, the deadlines. We do have, roughly about 5% based on last year's data of interconnection requests not processed within deadlines. And, once an interconnection has been approved, typically the permission to operate is 20 days. And you can see that less than 1% of our DERs did not get interconnected within that 20 days. And we only had 5% interconnection requests denied, but a vast majority of those are at level 1, and then they may get kicked into a level 2 request, and then they may get approved based on the level 2 review. So I think, although I don't have data to kind of tell me or give me a better picture of what's happening with those denials, I do think that the total number denied are less than those 4.9%, because really a lot of the level 1 interconnection requests get kicked into level 2 once they're denied at level 1. So I'm going to move forward to the next slide, and it's kind of a tall task in a small amount of time that I'm allowed for this presentation, without consuming your whole meeting, to provide a background on interconnection.
Take your time, John.
Take my time. Okay.
Yeah, it's important stuff.
So what I've done, and I'm grateful to the engineering division of the Public Service Commission. I think, I don't know if DeAndre Wilson is on, but DeAndre is sort of, our engineering SME for interconnection up in the engineering division. And DeAndre has created this web page, which really provides a lot of background for small generator interconnection. So I'm just going to put that web page up briefly. So I'm going to take this down if I can figure out how to do that. Got to go to another screen, I guess. Okay, so now let's see if we can see the home page. All right, so now you're at the home page of the Maryland Public Service Commission. And what you want to do to get to this page is go to electricity. So you can see the headers. You should be looking at electricity, and then there's some links to various other web landing pages. If you go over to the engineering division, and then you see under engineering division, small generator interconnection, you click on that and you have the small generator interconnection web page. So basically it just provides some background. It also does a mapping of all the topics that have been reviewed and regulations promulgated with respect to interconnection. And you can see in what phase of the interconnection work group the particular topic was discussed and perhaps regulations promulgated. So, you know, for instance, if I wanted to look at energy storage integration, I would look in phase 1 and phase 2. And then you can see various other topics. So this is sort of a mapping. If you want to find more information on a particular topic, just look at the topic and look for the phase, and then go to the report for the phase. So following, you know, the mapping, you have the work group phases, and it's basically leads you to the various rulemakings where you can get the reports that were issued by the PC44 interconnection work group for the different phases, and you can get more information by going into those reports and seeing the results of the proceeding. I would say that group phase 3, we did not have regulations promulgated. We had some significant issues with regards to how we were dealing with cost allocation, which I'll discuss in a couple minutes. And we issued a report pretty much providing our status, but we did not petition for rulemaking. So there's a link to that particular report. But every other phase that we've completed, we have had a rulemaking going all the way back to RM61. Which I believe was in 2018. So in general, every, you know, our phases last roughly a year and a half between phases. And now we're on phase 6. If you want to join the interconnection work group, there's my email address. And you can also see when our meetings are, because every time I post a meeting, and I generally don't post more than one meeting in advance, and we're not on a periodic schedule like some work groups. Like I know Chuck's work group here pretty much does meetings every 2 weeks, but our meetings are more or less based on the cadence of the work group and what needs to be discussed. So you can go to the commission's work group calendar and see when our meetings are, or at least our next meetings are scheduled. You can also find the COMAR regs by clicking on this link. And we also have a, I won't click into it, but if you want to find more information on the sequencing of a typical interconnection process, you can go to the interconnection process summary through this link. So Chuck has told me that this work group has sort of been in love with smart inverters. Is that the term you use for Chuck? I'm, I'm joking.
I don't know if I would say love. That might be a strong word, but people are big fans of them.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan too. I really appreciate all the work that the work group did and the utilities. I really feel like the utilities stepped up to the plate to put these smart inverter standards in place. We are one of the few states in the United States that has a smart inverter standard at this point. And you really can't do grid modernization without smart inverters. I mean, dumb inverters, all they're good for is, converting DC output of battery energy storage systems, solar, into AC. But the smart inverters give you the capability to do a lot more to support the grid. You can support voltage. You can basically ride through disturbances with smart inverters. So, one of the things that we did with our smart inverter standard is we adopted some recommendations from PJM for ride through of voltage and frequency disturbances. Because what the problem was with these disturbances and NERC, which is the North American Electric Reliability Council, which pretty much monitors and enforces all the FERC standards related to transmission reliability. What they found is we were having disturbances, like transmission line trip outs and things like that, particularly in the Western United States, where you'd have a transmission line outage, and because of the voltage degradation, it was compounded because a lot of DERs were tripping offline because they could not withstand the voltage degradation, which was making the situation worse. Because if you have a loss of a transmission line, you really want your generational line to support your system, not drop off the system when you have a voltage disturbance. So that's why a lot NERC and FERC actually gave direction to the RTOs to start to implement these ride-through settings, and PJM had some collaborative workshops with the utilities and some of the state regulators, including myself, and they came up with recommendations for standards, and we adopted those standards. So there's a lot to smart inverters. I don't think we have time to go through, and some of it is very technical, but as of January 1st, 2024, we have a smart inverter standard in Maryland. And every DER that interconnects, so utility should not allow them to interconnect unless they have a smart inverter. Now, some of the larger utilities have their own customized settings, if you will, that are specific to their system, and those settings were approved by the commission at the administrative hearing, I believe, in November. But we do have a number of smaller electric utilities in Maryland, particularly some of the municipal utilities, which are very small, and we have some smaller co-ops in general. Some less than 100 customers, or at least one that I'm aware of. And they may not have the engineering expertise to basically develop their own smart inverter standards. So we have a minimum default standard for Maryland, and you can get that out on the PSC webpage. We've got it both described in detail as far as, well, I shouldn't say in detail. We have both a high level description of the standard, so it's more or less something you can read to see what the standard is in sort of technical terms, but easily understood by an engineer, I would guess. But then you have the actual settings themselves, which are out there courtesy of Exelon, and I do appreciate PHI in particular. I think their people basically developed, took our minimum statewide default standard and converted it into the actual settings. So there's, the actual settings that should be applied to those inverters are out there. And what we did with the minimum statewide default standards is we basically adopted the same standards that are the basis of all the utility standards, including the ride-through settings. But the only thing that we didn't adopt, because we really don't know, how some of these smaller utilities deal with their voltage control, we pretty much left the voltage control at unity power factor. So there is no voltage control with the minimum statewide default standard, whereas all the utilities that have standards, the SHMECOs, the different Exelon utilities, Atomic Edison, they all have voltage standards. But for the minimum statewide default standard, we don't have a voltage control setting other than unity power factor. So basically, the benefit of having the standard out on our web page is because a lot of times, manufacturers will want to know when they're shipping an inverter to a Maryland customer what the standard is. So the utility, I think EPRI may have a big database of manufacturers can basically know what the settings out there are, and when they ship something that like BGE, an inverter to a BGE customer, they have the ability. I don't know if they're doing this, but they have the ability to send an inverter with the standards already preset. But in any case, I know the utilities, when they're dealing with their interconnection, they're going to validate that the standards comply with their particular requirements that have been approved by the commission. So we have that out there, and that's what's referred to as the EPRI common file format, the settings. And lastly on here, if you have any questions about interconnection or smart inverters, certainly DeAndre, should be your contact. And also, we do occasionally get disputes between utilities and interconnection customers. So we have a link to our dispute resolution page. One of the problems that I have, at least when I was in the engineering division, is people would send their complaints directly to us in email. And I would always try to refer them through our Consumers Affairs division, because that's the proper way to get a complaint handled here at the commission, because they have systems that track these things to resolution, whereas if it's just handled by the engineering division, the records may end up getting scattered, and if there's a history associated with it that we need to research for some reason, we may not have that history. So we pretty much try to funnel all the disputes through our Consumers Affairs division, because they have, just like utilities have customer service systems where they keep a full record of customer interactions. Our CAD division keeps a full interaction of our customer interactions. And typically what CAD will do, Consumer Affairs division, is they will get an engineer involved in some of these technical matters, and the engineer will work through CAD to get the problem resolved. And the other benefit to to working through CAD is that utilities are required in COMAR to provide responses within 7 business days to a CAD complaint, whereas if we didn't have that work through CAD, there's really no regulations and that govern how time frame for utility response. Although most of the utilities are very responsive, so I don't want to give that impression that utilities are not responsive when engaged with the engineering division on different problems. But in general, probably covered dispute resolution in more detail than you really care. But in any case, just want to let you know that there is a process for that. So with that, I'll stop here and just ask if there are any questions before I move on further into the presentation. The next topic I'm going to be discussing is cost allocation. Okay, so I'm going to stop presenting the web page and just put my previous presentation up. Okay, so I'm going to go through every block on this diagram. Okay, not really, but in any case, this is MCAM. This is the Maryland Cost Allocation Method. It was just approved by the commission this past Tuesday, so 2 days ago. It's one of the reasons why we struggle with the phase 3 report that I talked about earlier. Phase 3 or 4, I can't remember. It's probably phase 4. But in any case, one of the problems in the industry, and I'll just diverge a little bit. I won't be focused on this chart, but one of the problems in the industry, and this is across the nation, not just Maryland, is when an interconnection customer wants to interconnect and there's available hosting capacity, it's not generally a problem because you have the ability to interconnect. You don't have to do what's called an upgrade to facilitate that interconnection. But when you do have a lack of hosting capacity, when you don't have enough hosting capacity, then you need an upgrade. And for the most part across the United States, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, there's a methodology called cause or pays that's applied. And what that means is that whoever causes the upgrade has to pay the full cost for the upgrade. And that is an impediment to interconnection because sometimes these costs can be very high, particularly, when you're dealing with, interconnections on primary feeders, and even, higher voltages. They can get very expensive to do these upgrades, and one of the other problems with cause or pays is you really can't do right sizing of an upgrade, because if that customer has to pay, that interconnection customer has to pay for the full cost of increasing hosting capacity to allow them to interconnect. Well, they don't want to pay for, upgrades above and beyond the capacity needed to facilitate their interconnection. So utility may have to come back later when you have a subsequent interconnection customers and upgrade again. So you really want the utility to use DER forecasting to basically, facilitate what's the right size upgrade? But the problem with cost allocation and cause or pays is, how do you allocate those costs? So what we want to do in Maryland, and what some of the other states are moving towards, and have moved towards in some states, is something called beneficiaries pays. So you got causer pays, where the causer pays the full cost, and you have beneficiaries pay, where the causer is only paying for the capacity for which it benefits. So you really can't do right sizing unless you go to beneficiaries pay. But to do that, right sizing, you need distribution system planning. You need DER forecasting. You need to be able to look at an upgrade and say, what's the right size of it? And you can't do that without some sort of forecasting. When utilities are planning load, capacity expansion for load, they're looking at load forecasting, and they're saying, well, in the next 5 years, we anticipate, X amount of load. So we're going to basically right size this, capital investment to be able to handle that load. And that's been traditional utility business, for as long as the industry has been around. But utilities do not have the experience in DER forecasting. There are many assumptions that have to go into DER forecasting. And if any of you had attended our distribution system planning technical conference last Thursday, we had an expert, Julieta Geraldes, from Kavala, who talked about the complexities of DER forecasting. But that's really where we need to go. We need to have processes in Maryland for utilities to forecast DERs, and we have to have some visibility on the assumptions that are being used in these forecasts. And that really is going to be your role as distribution system planning, and that gets into the some of the overlap between the interconnection work group and the distribution system planning group, because I can't tell you how many times that stakeholders have wanted the interconnection work group to do DER forecasting and hosting capacity analysis. It's just not the role of the interconnection work group. The interconnection work group is there to basically remove obstacles to interconnection, not to do planning. And we really needed to have a distribution planning process stood up to work on those details. Right now in Maryland, I do think some of the utilities are taking baby steps towards DER forecasting, and some may be further along. Some have done nothing with DER forecasting up to this point. But I do think that some of the stakeholders in our work group, particularly OPC, and has voiced the need to basically understand the assumptions and the guardrails around DER forecasting, because obviously in something that is relatively new and affects capital expenditures, there needs to be some visibility and some alignment on how utilities are approaching that. So I'm sure I haven't participated in many of these distribution system planning work group meetings, but I'm sure that's come up in some of your previous meetings, and I'm sure it's not just OPC, it's likely other stakeholders also. But what we try to do in interconnection work group is just come up with a method for allocating cost. We left some of the other aspects that were more related to distribution system planning alone, but we did think, because of the fact that our interconnection process allocates costs, meaning utilities will levy cost for upgrades, we needed to attack cost allocation. And we came up with this methodology. But before I get into this methodology, I'll just say that, for the most part, the discussion I've had up to this point has been about primary voltage. But we also have a problem with secondary voltage, meaning 600 volts and below. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten complaints about secondary voltage interconnection also. In particular, I've even had meetings with some delegates and things of that nature in the past on behalf of their constituents. And a typical example was, a conference call that I had about a year or so ago, maybe a year and a half ago, with a delegate who was considering submitting some legislation because they were not happy that a certain utility basically would have to upgrade a distribution service transformer to facilitate an interconnection of a residential solar customer, and wanted to charge that customer $8,000 in this particular case for the upgrade of that transformer. But that's what it would cost. I mean, and under causer pays, whoever is causing the upgrade has to pay the full cost. And of course, that homeowner is not going to want to pay $8,000 to upgrade that transformer. So if you go from like a 25 kVA to transformer to like a 50 kVA transformer, now you got the ability for all the homeowners, that are also serviced from that transformer to interconnect and be a free rider, and then basically the first causer homeowner, paid for the new service transformer, and then all the other subsequent homeowners that wanted residential systems could basically interconnect using that capacity until you needed another upgrade. So we not only had a problem with primary voltage interconnection, we had the problem with secondary voltage interconnection. And we have two different methodologies for cost allocation, one at primary voltage and one at secondary voltage. So I realize that this chart is rather complicated. It is in standard flowchart symbology, but I'm just going to not get into a lot of the detail in the smaller letters because I know you probably can't see it on the screen. But when an interconnection request comes in, and basically you have to ask a few questions. Is the first question you have to ask is the distributed generator point of interconnection at the secondary voltage or primary voltage, because we have two different methodologies. If it's at secondary voltage, you go down, and hopefully you can see where I'm sort of circling my cursor to this secondary voltage pathway. If it's a primary voltage, you go to another pathway, which is a primary voltage pathway. So let's stick with just primary voltage at this point. If it's the primary voltage pathway, the next question you have to ask is hosting capacity available? And if it is, then it's a lot simpler process, and you go down to this primary voltage fee pathway, which I'll discuss later. But if it isn't, then you need to do an upgrade project, which is what I discussed earlier. So basically, in this process, a utility will do the upgrade, and we also want the utility with MCAM to right-size that application or right-size that upgrade. And then they will collect, in this box here, they'll collect the revenues for the upgrade. And basically, it's only the share of the benefits. So, if you add 100 kilowatts of hosting capacity and interconnection customers only using a quarter of that, they would get charged a quarter of the cost of the upgrade. And the rest of the, and then that interconnection customer would, be interconnected, which is this red box. But what happens to the remainder of the money? Basically, that isn't collected, because the utility, in this case, 75% of the project, in my example, wasn't collected. Well, you want the utility to accumulate all these upgrade costs in a bucket, and that gets distributed over all interconnection customers. So we are no longer allowing interconnection customers with MCAM to get a free ride. Everybody's going to pay a little bit for the hosting capacity, because if you don't collect these unallocated costs from interconnection customers, then ratepayers will have to pay for it, and that's not a good outcome either. So basically, all the unallocated upgrade costs get allocated. We have a locational way, which I'll discuss later, of allocating it. And then, now we're showing that in this box below that they all get assessed a fee, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail. And that's pretty much the primary voltage MCAM. The secondary voltage MCAM, we decided that we didn't need this complicated method for that. What we're basically doing is, anytime there's a secondary voltage upgrade, you have to upgrade transformers. We're just collecting all that money in a big bucket, and we're every year we're kind of resetting the fee for customers. So that customer that I was talking about before, that got the cost for $8,000, to upgrade a transformer. Basically, in the future, the utility would just upgrade the transformer, maybe charge each customer, including that customer who would have had the $8,000 charge, maybe $100 or $200 would be charged. So we're removing obstacles to interconnection, and that's the whole philosophy of MCAM. So here's an example of primary voltage, and I also have the secondary voltage, just based on PEPCO data. And I want to be very clear, highlighting this. This is illustrative only. It's based on sample calculations using some data from PEPCO in 2022, which, once this goes into effect, which is about 1 year from when the regulations become effective, and it's going to take a couple of months for the regulations to become effective. So you won't see this until 2025 in Maryland. These are not going to be the costs you see in 2025. So, but this is based on 2022 PEPCO data. And what I have here is a hosting capacity map. Hopefully most of you have seen an example of a hosting capacity map. I would have liked to just isolate it on PEPCO, but I really couldn't maneuver on their hosting capacity maps. So what you're saying is basically Delmarva and PEPCO, and maybe even outside of Delaware and Maryland, it looks like. But in PEPCO and in Delmarva, they're all part of PHI, and they have a consistent way of generating these hosting capacity maps. And you really can't see this that well, but the different colors show areas of different levels of congestion. So the areas that are in red, or areas in black, have no hosting capacity available, and there's very few. You can see some of that in the Delmarva. But areas that only have up to 250 kilowatts of hosting capacity available are in red. And then, different colors, like the cyan is, less congested. And then I think the light green is pretty much uncongested for the most part. what we wanted to do with MCAM is not just levy a fee, but we wanted to make it locationally based, and I have to credit OPC and their consultants from Stratagen, who helped us develop this methodology based on their experience. To have a locationally based cost allocation means that you're providing signals to interconnection customers where it would be cheaper to interconnect without basically requiring upgrades, because you don't want interconnections in these red areas because you have to do upgrades. And basically you want interconnections in sort of the cyan or the light green areas. So you want to charge customers, you want to send a price signal to interconnection customers to have them, provide them some locational incentive on where to interconnect. So that's what the MCAM does. It's a locational fee system. Utilities can still petition because they may not be ready in 2025. Not all utilities will be ready to be able to have a locationally priced system. I know PE, for instance, doesn't have a hosting capacity map even out there yet, but I think is putting one in this year in around the May time frame. So, I think a utility can petition to have just one fee until it's able to apply this locational based method. But when you look at the cost over here, this light green area, and I'm highlighting this on the screen, the light green areas, the way the calculation works out, depending on the assumptions you make, generally, $2.5 to $3.5 bucks per kilowatt, which is not going to be a significant obstacle to a primary voltage interconnection. But when you get down to, the higher constrained levels, like the red levels, it could be between $31 and $47 per kilowatt to interconnect there. So, the beauty of the MCAM is that it's basically providing incentive for interconnection customers that have a choice to incent them to locate their projects in areas where you have least congestion. And then in the secondary interconnection, which we talked about, it's about $79 per application using the PEPCO data. But I think I can't recall the utility, but one of the utilities was in the $100-$200 range. But for the most part, at least initially, we're saying that it should be less than $100 for the secondary application. So that's my discussion of MCAM, both secondary and primary. Sorry for laboring through this. Any questions at this point?
Hey, John, Ethan Holmes here. When will the quiz on this be?
Well, you should be able to pass the quiz, Ethan, since you worked with us on all this. But no quiz today. But it is something that I'm sure that people are going to be curious about as we get ready to implement it in 2025. Any other questions?
Yeah, John. Mr. Bartlett.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rakowski. A tremendous presentation, a lot of information. Just a secondary point, and then I don't know if David Kethen's on because he had to drop off at one point for another meeting. He has some relevant comments to some of the things you've talked about, but I just wanted, in terms of this hosting capacity issue and the map, It Pepco and Delmarva still have, and it's on their websites, the 3 megawatt definition of limit of capacity and limitation, so that this map basically, I assume, is applying that definition to the mapping of hosting capacity. Whereas one of the points that's under discussion, and I know that your working group has discussed it also, and apparently at the January 9th hearing, the commission charged our working group, the distribution system planning working group, with studying some of the aspects of hosting capacity, potentially including the 3 megawatt cap. But other states, as you know, have used a feeder specific technical analysis of capacity that usually is much greater than 3 megawatts. And so on a 13 kV feeder. And so if you use that alternate approach, then the colors on this map assumedly would change. So that's just one point that I wanted to make. And then there are a couple of additional issues that come up in relation to the connection between our working group and the interconnection working group. But I just wanted to make sure, is this map that you're showing us is still using that 3 megawatt capacity limitation as Delmarva and Pepco actually apply them now?
Okay, well, thanks for the question. And yeah, this has received a lot of discussion. But let me take you back so that everybody in the work group understands how we got to this point with the 3 megawatt limit that's applied by PHI utilities. And back in phase 2 of the work group's efforts, we wanted to, again, our mission is to eliminate obstacles to interconnection. And we had situations where utilities had to close their circuits from interconnections because of the fact that there was no more available hosting capacity. And this is at the primary level, but it could also affect, residential homeowner. So, we're not talking about a service transformer. We're talking about a feeder limit here, where there's no hosting capacity available. So you have to restrict interconnections. And we just didn't want to have a situation in Maryland where a residential homeowner couldn't install a residential system because there was no hosting capacity available at the primary voltage feeder level. And the commission agreed that that was an undesirable situation. So what we proposed in phase 2 and was codified in regulations is the ability for utilities to reserve hosting capacity for residential interconnections based on their forecast of the potential for residential interconnections. So, for instance, sort of having a brain lapse here, but let's talk about 3 different types of feeders. So in the one example, you have a rural feeder. There's maybe the density of housing is not great, and so you wouldn't expect to have to reserve a lot of hosting capacity on a rural feeder for residential interconnection. So your DER forecast for that rural feeder, you would hardly reserve anything. You might reserve a couple hundred kilowatts. But if you get into, a suburban setting or even an urban setting where you have the potential for a lot more residential customers interconnecting and solar, and the demographics of the area, we tend to know that rightly or wrongly, I mean, there are equity considerations here, but the residential homeowners are installing solar generally, in higher income areas and things like that. So you should basically be able to use the demographics, the feeder density and any other data in your DER forecast to say how much you should be reserving for these residential customers. So the problem comes that utilities have not developed their DER forecasting. So the intent of the regulation was there to not have one static number like 3 megawatts, but where it met reality was, the fact that utilities don't have the capability to forecast DER, at this time. Although I do think PHI is probably out in front of some of the other utilities in Maryland when it comes to at least what I've seen in presentations. I think even in this work group. So we don't want just one static 3 megawatt level, but we do want to have some level of reserve hosting capacity, because again, we never want a situation where a residential customer can't interconnect. I feel like that was reinforced at the hearing on Tuesday when the commission approved the regs and they approved the CCSA recommended additions to wording that really require the utilities to do this circuit specific. I personally feel like the wording was correct when we originally did it, but it does help clarify that you really can't do this across the system with one number. You needed to have a circuit specific determination of reserve hosting capacity. So I'm looking forward to seeing what the utilities do in response. The sooner the better. I think at a minimum, utilities should be looking at, even in the absence of more detailed DER forecasting, they should be looking at, rural versus urban versus suburban, looking at maybe some of the demographics and just, even if they don't have their DER forecasting techniques on, they should at least be able, instead of having one level, maybe have, 6 levels, something of that nature, instead of applying one number across the system. And I made that suggestion, but at this point, I'm not aware that there's been any movement by the utilities on that. So I realize I was rather long-winded, but I think this is one of those situations where the intent was good, but maybe the implementation, has some opportunities for improvement.
Yeah, and thank you for that detailed explanation, and that's very helpful to know what the status is now after Tuesday, because the other working group that I've participated in is Community Solar or the Net Metering Working Group, and I know that in rural areas where people are trying to build community solar projects, that 3 megawatt cap had turned out to be a significant obstacle, and particularly now that we've got community solar is going up to 5 megawatts, so that became a significant problem. So I appreciate the work that's been done on that. I just I saw Ethan's hand up, but I just wanted to throw a couple of things into the discussion about the relationship between the work that your working group has done and the things that this working group is doing or maybe is supposed to do.
Can I hold you off on that? Because that's what my next slide addresses.
Oh, okay. Okay. I didn't know if we were at a pause or an end. Okay, thanks.
No,
Sure.
I have a cleanup slide next.
All right, before you get
Okay.
there, John, Ethan, did you want to weigh in on something, sir? I saw you posted a couple things in the chat.
Yeah, and I posted a link twice. The explanation is this is not the map that would reflect that 3 megawatt limit that Al is referring to. That would be the restricted circuits map, and I just dropped the link in. We have different maps for small and large generation interconnection. So
Yeah,
I wanted to include that. And then also, I'm having people ping me with the note that we are working on how to lift that limit while still have a reservation system for which we refer to in our comments that we submitted, I think on JADE 5.6, that reserve hosting capacity is determined by circuit-specific metrics. So we are looking at ways to maintain that reservation. Just wanted to clarify those points. Thanks.
Thank you, Ethan. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my last slide. If I can find how to do this. All right. So January 9th, we had a supplemental rulemaking for RM81, and we did get approval of some proposals for MCAM, which we talked about. But we also got approval of hosting capacity upgrade plans and some power flow enhancements because utilities have, use power flow or rules of thumb to evaluate interconnection requests. We also provided some flexible interconnection options, which, allows customers, for instance, interconnection customers, to basically, if a utility says you need an upgrade to interconnect, it allows them the option that they could curtail, at the request of the utilities to avoid that interconnection upgrade. So, again, we're trying to remove impediments to interconnection, and this was one of those things that we'll have to see how that plays out. If interconnection customers will be able to take advantage of the flexibility that we now have in the regulations. We also got something approved with meter collar adapters, and this is not the final approval. Meaning it's in regs that there are certain prerequisites to installing meter collar adapters. But really, we want the utilities and some of the OEMs that are doing these meter collar adapters, like Tesla and Connect DER, which were active in our work group. And there are some other outfits out there also making these meter collar adapters. We wanted them to be considered in Maryland because, again, we're all about removing obstacles to interconnection. What a meter collar adapter allows you to do, I should have had a picture here maybe, but it's basically a collar that you put between the meter and the meter box, and it allows you to interconnect either a small generator. It also allows you maybe even to install a heat pump without upgrading your service panel in the home. So this could save a lot of money for homeowners going forward if they had the ability to install these meter collar adapters to facilitate interconnection or heat pump installation. I do think, although this is the interconnection work group that proposed this, I do think a lot of the benefits are going to come with electrification when homeowners are going to be upgrading to cold climate heat pumps and things of that nature. If these meter collar adapters can be used, it could avoid a service panel upgrade. So we had that approved, but they still need collaboration between the utility and the OEM, and then there's a dispute resolution process that we enhanced, expecting that there are going to be maybe some disagreements by utilities and some of these OEMs. So the dispute resolution process was codified, and really the dispute resolution process was basically talks about some of the things I talked about earlier when I was discussing dispute resolution on the web page. Then we have what I think Dr. Bartlett was getting into with the interconnection work group issues that overlap with this work group. And I'll go first and Dr. Bartlett, you can let me know if I missed something that you think should have been discussed. But number one is, determining hosting capacity available. Every utility does it a little bit differently. I think there's probably a lot more commonality among the Exelon utilities because they're all using similar software products than between PE and Schmecco and the Exelon utilities. But basically, determining hosting capacity available is a planning function. So it's something we really feel like has to be dealt with by this work group. They have a common approach to hosting capacity. And there are various methodologies. If you read some of the IREC reports, you can see that there are various methodologies that should be used, and maybe there should be multiple methods depending on the use case, a particular use case involved. But we really feel like that's a distribution system planning function. Right now in our regs for interconnection, we don't, since we're not specific, the utilities can continue to use their methodologies for determining hosting capacity that they have now until, we get a process that is more or less standardized in Maryland. But we didn't want that to be an impediment to us moving forward. And I could say not all stakeholders agreed. In fact, there are a number of stakeholders that felt that maybe we shouldn't even have done MCAM until we had, a defined process was common among all the utilities for determining hosting capacity available. But, there are, as you're seeing through distribution planning, there are a lot of things that the utilities do different in all manners of capacity planning. And this is no different at this point, but it is critically important to get a common approach to hosting capacity because it's very important. Then we have the DER forecasting needed to determine reserve hosting capacity, which is the issue brought up by Dr. Bartlett about 3 megawatt limits that are being imposed to reserve 3 megawatts on the feeder for reserve hosting capacity, but we really need that to be forecast. Again, in some of the rural areas where a lot of these community solar might be installed, you really shouldn't have hardly any reserve hosting capacity because there's just not a need for it. Whereas, it may be appropriate in a residential suburban area where there are a lot of affluent housing and things like that people are putting a lot of solar. It may be entirely appropriate to have a 3 megawatt limit on the circuit. We also need forecasting for right sizing. If you recall my MCAM discussion, we want to right size interconnection upgrades. To do that, it really should be considered by the distribution system planning process. And in fact, there was a motion taken at the RM81 hearing on Tuesday by the commission to basically indicate that they want distribution system planning to undertake this topic. And then there's something we haven't talked about. I should have mentioned it up here, hosting capacity upgrade plans. And what this is, we talked about MCAM. But if you look at some other states, and the two examples or let me just say the two examples we focused in our work group on was one in Massachusetts and one in Texas and maybe some other states. In Texas, I'll take Texas first. It's brought to our attention from Exelon that there's a concept out there called solar ready areas, where utilities are improving the hosting capacity proactively in areas where they are seeing the potential for significant solar development. So, instead of going through and, having a reactive process where, you don't upgrade until you get an interconnection request, the concept of a hosting capacity upgrade plan is really to create hosting capacity in advance of those interconnection customers wanting to interconnect. And so we call it DER ready areas because we didn't want to be wedded to solar. We wanted to be agnostic to the technology because it could apply to any DER. But we did want to have the ability for utilities to use their forecasting to say, hey, we're seeing the potential for a lot of DERs in a particular area, and we want to get ahead of this. And we're allowing the utilities to come into the commission and say, hey, we want to, have a hosting capacity upgrade plan for this area. And also, what that would cost. So anything that would be in that area would handled differently than the MCAM process, because there would be specific fees that would be calculated based on what is being done to, add hosting capacity in that particular area. And the utility would have to come in with, a number of different elements of their plan and address cost, among other things. So that was approved. And to do this, you need these issues to be part of the distribution system planning process. Because again, determining the areas, that's a plan, and you need distribution system planning. So Dr. Bartlett, I'll turn it back to you. Is there any areas of overlap that I missed?
No, and looking ahead to the next section here, one of the things that Mr. Kazin, again, I don't know if he's on because he had to go off to another meeting and then we'll come back perhaps, but this issue of implementation of FERC 2222 and the whole issues, the set of issues related to DER aggregation and how that interacts with hosting capacity analysis. He raised a number of technical points about that. And I'm not sure whose bailiwick that falls into. I am impressed by the areas that you've identified here because we've moved from the DER forecasting block and we're in the hosting capacity block of Jade, but you've put some important tasks. And I think that the motion that was passed on the 9th that says that somewhere between us, we have to work out this right sizing issue in terms of DER forecasting and hosting capacity. So we're going to have to figure out how those things get done in more detail, I think, than we have done. So those are just some of the points that I see coming out of your presentation.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I haven't covered the phase 6 yet, but the big emphasis of phase 6 for our work group is going to be implementing FERC Order 2222. Now, I've developed a white paper, which is out there. I'm going to revise that white paper shortly. I've shared it with PJM, and I actually have a meeting with PJM tomorrow where they're going to provide me their feedback on our FERC Order 2222 white paper, because it kind of lays out what we need to consider going forward to be able to implement that particular order for DER aggregation in Maryland. And PJM, the compliance filing that they made with FERC, they basically indicated that they would be ready to implement that order in, I believe, February of 2026. So we got roughly 2 years to implement FERC Order 2222 in Maryland. And, I plan on taking a somewhat more holistic approach than just focusing on DER aggregation for selling into wholesale markets. I feel like we need to also look at some other things that are kind of related, because we're starting to get into, you know, things like virtual power plants and B2G and things of that nature. You know, we don't have a lot of work done on those topics at this point. I know in Annapolis there's a piece of legislation that I saw a few weeks ago where it's called the Drive Act, which I joke around here, it's probably going to drive me to retirement, but if it's passed. But in any case, it wants us to implement things like that, you know, at the commission, and it has some very aggressive time frames for it. Now, I don't know what's going to actually, you know, I haven't seen where that bill is, but there's a lot of overlap in that Drive Act and FERC Order 2222. And, you know, so I want to take a more holistic approach. And the other problem, you know, with FERC Order 2222 is that not all of it is interconnection related. You know, but my group, at least, you know, the white paper that we've developed gets into some of the non-interconnection related areas, and not because interconnection work group is going to handle everything with FERC Order 2222 compliance, but, you know, I also work for the commission, and I want to make sure that we have the proper handoffs here in the commission to handle some of these areas that are, you know, not directly related to interconnection. So, you know, one of the biggest issues that I see that's not interconnection related that we need to handle is, you know, PJM is delegating dispute resolution to Maryland for a lot of these DERs, even DERs that participate in wholesale markets. Basically, they're taking the position that if it's not directly related to their tariff, then the state should handle the complaint. And I do think that's going to cause us a significant ramp up of resources needed to handle some of the dispute resolutions. So, and there are other areas that we're going to get into. You know, I mean, my white paper covers, you know, not only, you know, how we can allow DERs to participate in aggregations and what we need to do with registering these DERs, and, you know, their size and constraints, but, you know, there are market issues. You know, market issues are beyond interconnection work group, and we're going to need, you know, some of the folks at the commission here to deal more with the market issues to be dealing, you know, with some of those issues. But you know, our issues in the interconnection work group are going to be, you know, more along the lines of registering the DERs, how they can participate in the DERs as a distributed energy resource aggregation. You know, there's modeling issues, there's interconnection process issues, there's cybersecurity issues, there's metering requirements, but there's also settlement issues that are beyond the capacity of the interconnection work group. But some of these issues need to be discussed, at least at the state level. There's telemetry issues, and among a lot of operations coordination that, you know, the state's role is to make sure we can implement DERs, again, the distributed energy resource aggregations, you know, to allow market participation, you know, by these aggregated resources, but not to cause, you know, reliability problems or other issues on a Maryland system. Okay, so I'm pretty much done. I see we have a hand raised.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, no, thank you. This, looking at your second section there, it just makes me wonder whether between you and Judge McLean whether we'll have to back up a little bit. I know we want to keep moving forward towards our April report, but there are a number of requirements related to DER forecasting that I think perhaps we haven't gotten into in the level of detail that I think you're implying, and the requirement coming out of the recommendation that was approved in the Tuesday hearing about right sizing. I think we have to think more about that one, but basically these, I think, require us to do a little bit more thinking about DER forecasting. But and the third one, or the fourth one rather, the forecasting to determine areas in need of hosting capacity. It did strike me that in the technical session that we had, Commissioner Suchman said she was very interested in seeing us deal with ways to direct DERs to the best places and away from areas that create constraints. And that kind of goes along with what you said. And I think it was Julieta also, Giraldez talked about not just using probabilistic analysis and adoption propensity modeling, ways of thinking of enhancing the fit between what's forecast and what actually happens. And so I think it seems to me we've got some additional thinking to do in that area, and how we split that between the two groups and have it come together as a coherent product that the commission can get behind is a challenge that I think we'll just have to figure out how to take on. But I will look to you and the judge to figure out how we do that. But hopefully others will want to weigh in as well. But that's my 2 cents.
Mr. Cathan?
Yeah, thank Al for being talking about me thus far. I'm actually listening in on a MISO call on related issues right now. So I really have a question for John, and it's I know you can't speak for the commission, and I do appreciate you're listing the number of issues that are not necessarily related to the work of the interconnection work group. So my question is, do you believe that the commission will give any direction, to the IWG and to any other parts of, the work groups on some of the issues that you listed? That was going to be, I thought, part of the technical, the hearing was on the agenda and never gotten to on the end of the day on Tuesday. So will the order that will come out about RM81, do you believe it will do some direction?
There will not be an order on RM81. There will be minutes, and the minutes will simply capture the motions for the most part. But I do think that we've already laid out in our report the things that we're going to be working on at phase 6, and we're just going to continue to work on them, even absent, specific direction from the commission on these things. Because generally my work group, no idea is a bad idea. We look at things and, we may not do certain things, but we do have a discussion of them. The only time that, once we get started, because I try to keep my work group phases at a year, no longer than a year and a half, items that aren't inserted for our review up front, sometimes we'll get carryovers. For instance, we did have a lot of suggestions at the end, which of our work group, which were really good suggestions about things that we should be looking at, particularly with regards to technical interconnection requirements that some DER industry stakeholders felt were needed review. And these are items that, we can't codify everything, but these are specific requirements utilities have for interconnection that aren't necessarily codified in the regulation, but some stakeholders felt that there needed to be more discussion because they viewed them as obstacles to interconnection. And we also, had a lot of other little things like, penalties for withdrawal of DERs that are in an interconnection queue, maybe fine tuning some of our timelines for finalizing, project details and cost, things of that nature. So there were a number of things that were introduced at the end of phase 5 that we really couldn't get to because of the cadence of our work group that'll be in phase 6. But I don't think we need a commission order, get to your original question, to work on the things that we said that, we think we need to work on. It was good to get the commission agreement that, this right sizing issue really should be dealt with in a planning, work group. And, I really view anything hosting capacity dealing with the way we calculate it for the different use cases or the way we're using forecasting. I view those as all planning functions, and I would hope that this work group would make some recommendations in those areas, because my interconnection work group seems to get bogged down sometimes with these issues, which are really beyond our scope.
Thank you for that. So I guess the outstanding question still remains, which is, how will the remaining issues that are not necessarily, I totally understand that, there'll be a number of issues the interconnection work group will looking at, but how will these other issues like markets and settlement and things like that, is there a plan at the commission on how to allocate those, to work groups?
Keep in mind, we put out a white paper. Up until this point, we haven't done anything beyond the white paper to identify the issues. But we will be working on them. And again, I work for the commission. I'm not going to let these things drop. So we'll make sure that we have, regardless of whether it's work done directly by the interconnection work group or some other area of the commission, we'll make sure there's a handoff.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David. Anything else from anybody?
Any other questions for John? All right. Thank you very much for your time this morning, John, and punting what appear to be several issues to us. So,
always glad to help.
Yeah. Maybe we should form another work group.
Well,
no.
Anyway,
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
All right. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it, and I know where to find you if I've got questions.
Yeah. All right. See you all later.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right. Good stuff. All right. So let's move on to, we'll come back to the right sizing and reserve capacity. There's other issues that John noted. Let's talk about the comments that were filed today or for today's meeting. There were a few areas of agreement, and hopefully everyone got to see the comments Ethan circulated yesterday on behalf of the joint utilities that responded to MEA, OPC, Dr. Bartlett, and Mr. Verchinsky. All right, anybody want to jump in, kick things off? All right, Ethan, I'll kick things off. Why is OPC's proposal to update the hosting capacity maps monthly and possibly as needed on specific feeders not doable? I know you said there's a resource issue, but anything you could expand on there?
Just it's just a very timely and labor-intensive process that requires lots of computing time. And yeah, I mean,
Okay.
we don't always get a lot of changes, so a requirement also would put us in a situation where nothing has actually changed, but we're being asked to do some, minor rerun everything for one minor tweak.
Okay.
We just consider it more than is necessary to provide value to customers, especially a select group of customers.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Virginsky.
I imagine these updates of maps has been facing California squarely in the face for the last couple of years. Does anybody know how often they update their hosting capacity maps? Because I mean, the generation at the edge of the grid is basically going to be through DERs. So this is a very critical area for us to deal with. So does anybody have any information on that?
I believe it's monthly. Sorry, Sam, go ahead. You raised your hand.
Oh, did I? Good. Okay. Like, actually, I didn't. I did raise my hand. Yeah, I can speak to that. California. So there are several states that update their hosting capacity maps monthly. Those are California, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Oregon. And I guess while I have the microphone, and just because I'm here on behalf of sort of the DER industry, one of the things I wanted to underscore about this recommendation from OPC that we strongly support is the reason this is important is predominantly for the sort of interconnection application use case for hosting capacity maps. And by that, I mean when solar project developers are identifying locations that they want to submit an interconnection application for, it's really important that they have the most up-to-date information about where the grid is constrained versus not, right? And that creates a lot of important benefits for utilities themselves, because the idea here is that, when solar project developers have better information, they're able to submit a much more viable interconnection application. So the outcome here is it'll reduce work on the interconnection side for utilities, because they won't have as many unviable interconnection applications to process. So, this falls into the category of sort of information transparency that, again, helps improve the interconnection process itself. And I know we're here in the DSP work group, but obviously all of these things sort of overlap. So I just wanted to call that out as like one reason for that recommendation in particular. I think updating maps monthly is the best practice that we should be aiming for. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Tim.
I will also emphasize the second part of our recommendation of looking at the as needed basis, and this is something that we've seen in other areas. We also worked with utilities in Illinois about this, and kind of came to some just a mutual interest in doing this kind of on a circuit by circuit basis, for exactly the reason that Ethan brought up, is that it is intensive to run the entire system, especially when a lot of interconnections are concentrated in specific locations. And so it seems very useful to have criteria that, like, thresholds at which enough change has happened on a given circuit to say, okay, we need to actually reanalyze the hosting capacity. And so that can be done immediately, and that saves time and energy in doing the entire hosting capacity map, while also actually creating a more accurate look at the system hosting capacity on circuits that are changing rapidly. So you can now look at, say, like, a feeder that gets 2 interconnections within the course of a couple of months can stay up to date within weeks rather than waiting till the next time the whole system gets done. So I'd strongly emphasize that second portion of on a feeder by feeder basis as needed.
So I get that. Just to clarify, you'd still want, OPC was still advocating for the whole system on a monthly basis. Is that correct? Or is that just kind of depending on if certain criteria are met?
I think that the goal is still to get to monthly system updates.
Okay.
But it is more acceptable to have quarterly updates if you can also update those high demand feeders when they change.
Okay. All right. Ethan, I'll go back to you. Does that do anything for you?
Why don't we, I'm currently pinging a few people who are much more technical than me. If we can come back to this in a few moments.
Yep. No problem.
Thank you.
Yep.
Sometimes these real-time answers are a little difficult to acquire.
No problem. No problem at all. Mark.
Thanks, Judge. Good morning, everybody. I think that it's important, and this was discussed in the comments, to know what exactly is being updated monthly, quarterly, annually. I mean, basically, there's 2 parts to the analysis. There's figuring out how much DER can go on a feeder, what's the total capacity, or a substation, and then subtracting what is already out there. I'm not saying we're committing to do this at Potomac Edison, but it would be a lot easier for us to adjust the maps monthly to just subtract any DER that was installed in the last month from the hosting capacity, for example, as opposed to doing a full system analysis of that feeder or substation every month or every quarter. So I guess I think it's important to say monthly updates, but what exactly is being updated monthly, quarterly, and annually? And I think we're proposing that the whole system assessment is done annually. So you're going to see those updates on that basis, but potentially you could see some updates quicker if it's just looking at what capacity has been added.
All right. Thank you, sir. Tim, is that kind of what you're looking for, or are you looking for something completely different?
This is getting pretty deep. Like in terms of methodology, there's we need to talk about exactly how we'd want to do the updates on a monthly basis and what level that goes at. I think that it's potentially helpful. I do think for one part of this pushback is that I think that the system analysis needs to happen more often than annually. And I think, again, we'd like to move towards monthly, but in terms of like this kind of more rapid updates on more of a feeder basis as needed, I think potentially the solution of just looking at the added capacity in terms of DER interconnections over that small amount of time is maybe a reasonable methodology to use.
All right, thank you, sir. Ethan.
Hi, yeah, I'm getting some similarly technical responses to Mark Zucka's, and to the Strategen team, and appreciating and to CCSA. Appreciating what everyone wants to get out of the hosting capacity maps, but also and I'm going to go back to one of my favorite themes, diversity of the utilities. If we can, remember as a work group to, not be as prescriptive, but rather look to get all of the utilities going towards goals and a plan rather than and understand that we may not be able to get something as far as our particular costs and systems, a monthly update in the very near future. That's just something I'd like to encourage everyone to think about when we try to come to a consensus on these items eventually. So I'm getting lots of technical answers that are going to be hard to parse into a monthly, quarterly, annually kind of answer directly.
All right. So you're not necessarily dismissing the monthly outright, but it would obviously be a process for everyone to get there. Is that under different time schedules potentially? Exactly. Okay.
And there's going to be system costs and labor costs that we haven't even estimated yet. The ever daunting IT costs.
Right. Okay. All right. Anybody else want to weigh in on this issue? I don't know that, seems like we made a little bit of progress, but I'm not. Go ahead, Tim.
I'll just really quickly, kind of towards the really the start of our recommendations on hosting capacity analysis, is that we definitely recognize that this is a whole, a whole journey to improve hosting capacity analysis. And so one of our like top level recommendations is that like this needs to Ethan's point, we think that every utility needs a roadmap towards improved hosting capacity analysis, what the steps are along the way, and how you get to those in timelines.
Okay, so, and I think Ethan agreed with you. He said that journey is a good description, and I would add that they're also a good band. All right, so it seems like at least the utilities are open towards moving, especially PE, since you guys don't have the hosting capacity maps, moving towards something probably not exactly what OPC wants, but something maybe in the same neighborhood. Is that fair, Ethan, Mark? Am I semi-fairly characterizing that? Okay.
Judge, Mark Zuga, yes, you are correct for Potomac.
Okay.
We did commit to adding hosting capacity maps by May of this year.
Right.
And other improvements, yes.
Right, okay, thank you. Eli.
Yeah, thanks, Judge. What I wanted to lay out is just to maybe kind of reiterate Tim's comment on a roadmap or journey, if you will. I think the idea of what we're trying to get at is we absolutely recognize that there are going to be things that prevent the utilities from being able to turn these into monthly updates tomorrow. These absolutely do take a roadmap. They will certainly take IT investment, and that should be done in a cost-effective manner, of course. And I think what we're just trying to get out there is that we need to move Maryland towards as real time of updates for hosting capacity maps as possible. And so, annual is my understanding is that's current state, again, for the utilities that have the hosting capacity maps. Moving towards quarterly is an improvement. Then moving towards monthly is an improvement from that, and moving towards increasingly real time from there, aligns with the crawl, walk, run approach that I've heard the utilities advocate for, which is understandable. And so I think we recognize that there is not going to be an immediate overhaul of this process, but there does need to be incremental change, and it should be slowly, but it does need to be improved in the immediate term. And just wanted to lay out, agree with the roadmap statement. If we can maybe all align on what a reasonable path forward looks like, and what a reasonable timeline to get to quarterly and to get to monthly might look like, I think that would maybe just put a finer point on this whole topic.
All right, no, that's good. That's good. Ethan, do you have a ballpark guesstimate as to when the joint utilities, and I know you're speaking for 3 utilities, when a quarterly update might be available, sir?
Not at this time.
Okay, that's fair. Mark, would you have anything on PE? I mean, assuming you guys are even in agreement with that thought process.
Correct. I mean, as I think our comments that we submitted earlier this week stand, we're working to provide the maps here in the next few months, and then we committed to doing a locational based hosting capacity assessment before the primary MCAM starts, which is probably 15 months or so from now. So we're focused on getting that first implementation right now, and can't really commit to kind of what the update looks like after that.
Understood. Eli, I guess, we can, Ethan, if you could just put that on your to-do list to kind of maybe circle back for our next meeting, or maybe in comments before our next meeting.
I am putting that in the notes right as we speak.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That would be great. Thanks.
All right. Okay. All right. I'm just kind of ticking down the joint utilities comments because they filed replies to everyone. All right, Eli, any response to the utilities opposition to including your DERQ info, feeder load, capacity data, grid topology?
Yeah, and I'll let Tim
Okay.
jump in here as well. But I think in general, I guess it might be helpful to get a better understanding of the utilities rationale for wanting to oppose that.
Okay.
I know that the comments were filed last night. I read them last night, and I read them pretty quickly. But if I recall correctly, it was that this information exists elsewhere was kind of the main point. And sorry, I'm seeing Ethan's comment just now that this person might not be able to respond to that.
Ethan, Ethan, are you talking about this current question or the question we just talked about?
Timing of hosting capacity upgrade to quarterly.
Okay. All right. No problem. Go ahead, Eli. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, thanks. Yeah, I think one, it was just a brief response. So maybe we'd like to better understand what the utilities rationale is in terms of opposing that recommendation. If I recall correctly, I think it was just that this information exists elsewhere. Initially, my thought would be that consolidating the information into one place such that it's easily digestible and understandable and can result in DER developers being able to take action based on that data. That's something we would certainly argue for. But let me maybe pause to see if utility folks are maybe able to add a little bit of detail as to why they oppose the recommendation. And then maybe for just the work group's benefit, I might just reiterate what OPC's recommendations were quickly. And I know we had about 10 pages of comments on this one, so it's a little bit lengthier. What we had recommended, so we already talked about update frequency, but on top of that, what we recommended related to hosting capacity, one, including hosting capacity values for all types of DERs, basically baking in appropriate assumptions for storage, for solar, etc. Two, that the hosting capacity methodology must become increasingly dynamic, so time varying to account for the flexibility of DERs. And then lastly, that hosting capacity map should provide supporting information for DER planning, like DERQ information, feeder load and capacity data, and grid topology data. I guess what would maybe be helpful is also for clarity from the utilities is if their opposition was just to that last point that I made, because I think that's what you were specifically pulling on, Judge. But maybe for clarity, if utilities could clarify if they were generally opposed to all three of those recommendations, which were OPC recommendations 2, 3, and 4 in our comments, or just the latter one. So maybe we'll start with getting additional clarity on where the utility opposition lies and rationale for it.
All right, very good. Ethan. Or anyone from the utilities. I don't mean to keep picking on you.
I'll give Ethan a break and I can jump in here. In terms of the opposition to the 3 points, I think we can follow up. I think our specific point, at least the one that has been referenced, was around the 4th bullet point. I think our kind of point there was obviously some of that information is already available to developers. I believe, at least my understanding, is the queue information, developers already have access to that information. And so, that's just kind of duplicative work and resources, that are then being spent by the utilities to provide information in duplicate. I think also one of our key points around the grid topology was security concerns about providing that type of information, with some of those kind of key system devices and providing information and location around those devices. And then finally, with the cost estimation tools, I think cost estimation tools can be a challenge sometimes of, if they're detailed enough to be able to provide a effective cost estimation for customers, it takes a lot of resources to be able to provide that level of cost estimation. And, when we're talking about these kind of things, we want to make sure we're providing those customers and those developers with accurate information and a good experience through those hosting capacity maps. So providing anything less than that obviously leads towards, miscommunications, misleading information, and a kind of a poor customer experience. And so trying to really provide like that deep level of, cost estimation for customers, I think we see as really being a very resource intensive, endeavor. As for 2 and 3, kind of briefly looking back at them, I think we had a question back to OPC around kind of clarifying when you speak about a storage capacity map. What if you could kind of describe a little bit more what you envision there? And I don't know if I have anything specific off 3 particularly at this moment.
Eli, I would note they actually agreed with OPC about the need for upgrades to create a more resilient distribution grid. So,
and we're getting to that on the
it's progress. Look at
that. To whittle down these issues a little bit, I'll hit our second recommendation first because I think it's the simpler part. In terms of like storage hosting capacity, I think it's very similar to EV hosting capacity, if I'm honest, and I believe that Pepco has an EV hosting capacity map. So I think that's kind of what we're getting at. John just mentioned in his presentation kind of towards the beginning that DERs are both loads and generation. And so looking at, even though they are loads and you can kind of traditionally plan for them too, they are also limited by like a hosting capacity. It's a load hosting capacity, but it is a hosting capacity. And so looking at what that load hosting capacity is as well, so that DER developers, including those that are looking at storage, have an idea of how much load they can put onto the system. EV charging can also look at where the capacity exists to put large loads onto the system, because particularly like when you look at like in California, there's a lot of articles coming out about how much delay there is in trying to install new DC fast charging, and that comes from this lack of load hosting capacity. And so the timelines for a lot of these DER loads for deployment are so much shorter than the utilities timelines for increasing hosting capacity. It means that they really can't work with that. And so it's better for them to understand in the outset how much load capacity there is, rather than to try and go through the kinds of processes that large developments do when they're trying to plan new load.
Okay, Tim, I think I see, we have an Pepco, I shouldn't say we anymore, I'm BG&E these days, has an EV load capacity map. And so I'm just going to be a persnickety utility guy here. And when we say hosting capacity or load capacity, we mean 2 different critters. And so when you ask for an EV or a storage hosting capacity map, that's where we get confused. So if we can keep those 2 terms separate, that would be very helpful for us, because we're going to, our engineer, we're looking at each other and trying to figure that one out last night. And okay, I think that actually clarifies it. Yeah, load capacity or hosting capacity.
Okay.
Load for EVs and storage, DER. Output is just think in terms of solar, and that's hosting capacity.
Okay.
So. Yeah, and generally speaking, storage increases hosting capacity or load capacity, which is a fun twist on that particular DER. That's why I love DERs. Okay, so glad we could sort through that language difference. That's very helpful.
Yeah. And I'm happy to start using load capacity where applicable. And I'm not certain this is one of those like details where does there need to be a different map for every type of DER? Probably not. But trying to look at what those differences are in operations that actually lead to significant changes in what you can put on the system, I think is something that's worth talking about. To say, look, EVs operate very differently from, I don't know, like whatever you want to compare it to, like a storage resource, if that's true. And so, your EV capacity might actually be quite a bit lower based on operational usage profiles. So just kind of considering those types of ideas in terms of what information is actually useful to developers.
Okay. Jacob, you got any response? I saw you nodding your head.
No, I appreciate the clarification, and especially for the battery one in particular. As you have mentioned, PepCo has and I think TPL as well, has an EV load capacity. So the one question was around the battery. So helpful to understand that further.
Tim, Eli, how do you get around, or what's your response to the security concerns of the utilities?
I, again, recognize that, you know, and this is something that everyone deals with. There are, trying to think of who has some system topology information. I want to say some of the California utilities do, but I want to, I'll start with this. I want to like make it clear of like what we're trying to get at. Like, what is the point of providing this type of information? And what we're looking at is, you know, any information that you can give to developers that lets them get an idea from the map, like what the extent of upgrades might be, the likelihood of upgrades, the kind of extent that you're going to get, etc. And that goes all the way to the, you know, the kind of far end of having our recommendation on interconnection cost estimates. You know, that's like the far end of like, provide them everything here. This is what it might cost to interconnect. The other, you know, those intermediate steps are these other information that we think that it's possible for utilities to provide. A lot of, and like, so all this comes from, you know, what are the things that create hosting capacity upgrade costs? The first step is whether or not you get the, you know, hosting capacity upgrade costs. The first step is whether or not there's hosting capacity. So making sure that the hosting capacity, like that's shown in the map, is accurate, etc. The second is a lot of these have to do with where you are in relation to protective devices. There's different load thresholds behind, you know, specific, you know, whether you're behind a recloser or, you know, so there's different locations that have different requirements. And so knowing whether or not your, you know, your hosting capacity limit is based on the recloser's capacity or the feeder's capacity or the substation transformer's capacity is really important to understanding whether this is going to be a $50,000 upgrade, $150,000 upgrade, or a $2 million upgrade. And so that's what we're trying to like kind of whittle down here is, where are you on the system? What is driving the hosting capacity limit? And then the idea of like knowing where the protective devices are in terms of like geographically is really, I think, more about distance. And maybe that's a way to get around security concerns of understanding linear distance from protected devices, because that can dictate how much needs to be reconductored. If you need like a DTT or something like that, like a direct transfer trip, you know, communication line, how long that line is going to be. So those are the kind of things that give you ideas of how much hosting capacity upgrades cost. And so that's what we're driving down at through this kind of this whole line of thinking. And so, yeah, finding where we can provide information that doesn't create security concerns, but are useful to developers to get an idea of what these costs are before they apply.
So a genuine question, and obviously, it sounds like you're very familiar with, distribution systems and, coming from the utility, having that background as well. If that information was provided to developers, are they going to be able to understand and translate, because I think your goal is what resources can be provided to developers to support them in their decision-making in locating DERs is providing that information. Are they actually going to know what to do with that information?
I think the better ones will. I really do think that the better ones will. In my understanding, yeah, I was going to say exactly that, Samantha, is like they either have a person on staff or they know a guy. Like
Yeah.
every DER developer
We'll
that
refer
I've
him to
talked
Tim and
to,
Eli.
what was that?
We'll refer him to Tim and Eli.
Yeah. Oh no, that's I don't do like full system planning. I know enough to like talk about it. I don't know enough to do it. But yeah, I would say that every DR developer that I've talked to, they work with consultants, or they have someone on staff that has done distribution system planning, upgrading, that kind of thing. And so they usually can parse this information at a much higher level than I can.
All right. So does that help out, Jacob? I mean, is that types of information? Can you provide that without, given the bad guys, all the locations of all the protective devices and things of that nature?
It's certainly something it's helpful to understand, kind of, again, talking through the perspective versus
sure.
just reading. Something I think we can take back and discuss further. Obviously, we still have some of those concerns and challenges, but can try and talk through and think through where some opportunities may lie, that balance, security concerns, resource challenges with providing that information. But it's helpful to understand kind of, the thought and purpose behind kind of some of those requests.
Okay, great. Now I just added that to my list to follow up on. Mark.
Yeah, thanks for the explanation. It's very helpful. One thought, and again, not committing to anything, but what if that information was provided in a type of pre-application request? As in, like, it's not on the map, but you can say, hey, I want to put something here on the circuit, and the utility then would tell you, okay, that's downstream of a 200 amp recloser. Again, not saying that we would. I mean, what would you think of that?
In the roadmap, it's a useful thing to have. It's a really good first step that can probably be implemented very rapidly. I will say that it is still more beneficial to have this on a map, where you can, before you ever, like, you can look at 100 different locations and think about what those relative ease of interconnection would be at those, and then whittle it down to these ones that you might put in an interconnection request for, or a pre-application request. But even with a pre-application request, they usually cost anywhere between like $200, $500. You're not going to put in 100 locations for that. I also would add that some of this, your system location is known. And so this can be automated, which makes it actually, like, again, lower like effort on your part to provide that type of information, versus having to actually like respond to a pre-application every time.
All right. Does that help you, Mark? Or it sounds like they just want more information up front before the application's even filed.
No, that's completely fair. I appreciate it. Just wanted to get some feedback on how that would work.
Appreciate it, sir. Samantha.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond directly to Mark as well. Your question or sort of recommendation about the pre-application process, I think that's a good idea. My concern with that is I think that's frankly going to be more work for you all, because rather than there being one place that everybody, meaning every developer, can go to, i.e. a map to look at, where the best place would be to apply for interconnection, you're going to be having to process a bunch more pre-applications. So, I think maybe that's a good short-term solution again, but I think longer term, I think it's more efficient to have more up-to-date hosting capacity maps so developers can put forward the most viable application possible, so that you're not doing a bunch of extra work and that sort of thing.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate that.
All right, so Jacob's, oh, there you go. I thought you were frozen there for a second. All right, you're going to follow up on the utilities info on that perspective. In terms of, Jacob, I can't recall it, on the hosting capacity maps, including values for all types of DERs. Do you recall where the utilities were on that?
Yeah, I think we had talked about that some just now with Tim. Is obviously we already provide solar,
Right.
ECO and DPL already provide EV load capacity maps, and we can talk further about batteries.
All right. All right. All right. Oh, OPC, do you guys want to? Oh, yes, Eric.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Just and Mike, pardon me, I just joined the conversation here. Curious, I'm hearing and ask for like multiple maps in regards to hosting capacity. That's typically on the DER. I'm hearing EV, which is load. I'm hearing load maps and things of that nature, right? I'm question I'm having is there an issue that we are presently having in Maryland that we can identify that these maps are solving? Is there an issue today with the rate that we are responding to load requests or even interconnection requests, right? Nor have we experienced anything historically when we were doing more, say, PVs a few years back. Just curious, what are we trying to solve here? What is the issue at hand? Why we believe? I understand from a transparency perspective, but I'm just, are we just looking to create these things because they are in California or they are in Montana already, or we're trying to solve issues that are local here in Maryland?
Go ahead, Samantha.
Hey, good morning. Sorry, I just rejoined. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I think I'm always interested in making sure we understand what problem we're solving here. I wanted to offer a perspective that's probably specific to community solar. And, I'll start by saying that I don't know that this is a problem in Maryland today. Like, I literally don't know. I will go ask, our members and developers about it. But the problem we're solving for is a very near term, however, future problem that we've seen occur in states like Maryland that have community solar programs open up, right? Maryland just passed legislation that would create a new community solar program that's pretty large, looking at sort of CCSA's work across the country. Maryland is one of the places where we're expecting to see some of the most community solar growth in the next few years. And that creates a lot of challenges in the interconnection and grid integration space, because developers come in all together. There's this huge influx of them, and they are, hoping to interconnect relatively large distributed generation projects on the grid. So that means they're submitting a ton of interconnection applications, and for example, at the beginning. And what we've seen in a lot of other states that have opened community solar programs, like Maryland's new one, is that utilities receive this huge influx of interconnection applications that sort of overwhelm their existing processes. So one of the ways of preventing that scenario is by having better information that developers can access up front before they submit an application, so that so that the utilities aren't then stuck processing a bunch of applications for what we call sort of zombie projects, or projects that will never get built. So what we're trying to avoid is a scenario where project developers need to use the interconnection application process as a prospecting tool, right? We want to have more information up front so that they can submit an application that's actually, viable, as I said. So that's one example or one scenario I can think of that this problem, or that these maps would help solve, specifically more frequent updates of the hosting capacity maps.
Thank you for that response, Ms. Weaver. I appreciate it. I think I think the hosting capacity maps that are being provided, if they're not providing enough data or they're not updated enough, right? I think that's a conversation we could have, and I think it's important for us to be pointing to the issues that's there, because we want to solve the real issues that's on hand and not go chasing other things. So I understand the point on being able to leverage the hosting capacity maps for interconnections. I think Mr. Zuka, if I pronounced that correctly, did also touch on you know, having requests for information, especially on the load side, if needed more information. But we do have processes now that are pretty flexible and has been working for a while. And I think we're preparing on our side to be able to leverage those processes and improve on those processes. So thanks for sharing that. Maybe frequency on the hosting capacity maps for interconnection and the concerns on the just being able to serve those requests on the interconnections a little bit more quickly. But I'm hearing about maps on EVs. I'm hearing about maps on other things which are load driven, right? That typically a new business request or a load request would answer a lot of those questions. I'm not sure if that is an issue we are trying to solve here too. I may be misunderstanding that, but just trying to make sure that we have a total clear understanding of what are the issues we're trying to solve, and as we continue to have these discussions, that they are focused on the issues on hand. So thank you, Ms. Weaver, for that. That's something that our team can take back, some valuable information we can take back and have some discussions around internally.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Wojcinski.
Yes, I want to pull a little bit on Eric's thread here. Where I think he's basically coming from is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But the whole endeavor of this planning process is to anticipate what we feel is coming within Maryland based on the CSNA, and that is a more rapid adoption of DERs. And do we have the maps that will provide that information for DER developers in the private sector? And, as I said in my comments, I can't speak to what developers want, but I do know that doing, an application basically for every DER that's coming in would be a very big ask for any utility to do, by providing comprehensive information through maps that are, are updated so that folks can use them. To me, makes a whole lot of sense in the long term. So, yeah, your process, Eric, might be working now, but it might not be working within 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. And, I just think we have to be very proactive in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right. Tim and Eli, to go back to you guys on the cost estimation tools. Did you guys have a response, utilities comments and Jacob's on the need for that and value of it to a customer, especially if it's not the most accurate estimate? Is that,
Yeah,
is this
I'll-
something that utilities typically do? We keep using California. Seems like we're going to be the California of the East. But you laugh, but I don't. You're not a Maryland fan, but Lefty Driesell was going to make Maryland the UCLA of the East. Probably dating. You guys probably don't understand that if you're not a college basketball fan.
I'm with you, Judge. Yeah, I'll start. I'll also let Tim feel free to jump in. I also definitely encourage Samantha to jump in as well, because I know she has obviously a lot of expertise in terms of what developers are actually looking for and what would be most useful. But as just a simple best practice, I think combining all relevant information, the whole purpose of hosting capacity maps is to better identify locations where DER developers can actually cite projects. And therefore, if you're able to include all of the relevant information to DER developers in one location to inform best how they can go about citing projects, obviously doing it all in one location rather than having to gather data across various forms and websites and applications, it's a relatively simple best practice. I think that's the primary gist of what our comments are here. I can't speak to what other states have done in terms of cost estimation within like a hosting capacity map tool, but I will note that I'm pretty familiar, or at least recently, as maybe a year or so ago, was pretty familiar with the hosting capacity maps in California, which did have caveats in place that discuss things about how the hosting capacity map estimates are directional, about basically the idea that we all understand that cost estimate is just that. It is a cost estimate. It is not final. And I think there can be reasonable caveats on hosting capacity map websites that clarify that a cost estimate is just an estimate. It's intended to be directional, not definitive and final. And therefore, I don't know that concerns around the estimates eventually being wrong are really valid, because I think an estimate is inherently not going to be 100% accurate. But I think in general, the best practice that we've seen is to have as much information in one place as possible, because the whole goal of these maps is to help developers determine where to put their projects, and that tool would just further the ability of them to do so. But I'll pause there. Tim, if you have anything to add, feel free, and also curious if Samantha has any thoughts.
I am also going to be curious to hear Samantha's thoughts, but I will just add that yes, recognizing that the cost estimates are the hardest one of our recommendations to meet there. That I agree with you, Eli, on all those points. I will add that the interconnection cost estimates become, like the exact cost estimates become less important if like the MCAM and some of OPC's recommendations about the way that we actually charge interconnection costs to interconnectors actually get approved. And so I just want to make that statement that, like, ideally, if you start to more socialize these costs, it is less impactful to know exactly what these costs are.
And this is Sam. I'll jump in here. I think I have to think about this one a little bit more. I think obviously, second or third, Eli and Tim's points about the fact that having more information that is up to date and in one place is better overall. That's the goal here. It's better for everyone, right? It's better for developers because they don't waste their time applying for interconnection in places that don't make sense. It's better for utilities because then they have to process fewer, non-worthwhile interconnection applications. And I think it would be a sort of a precedent-setting decision for utilities in Maryland to put cost estimates in the map. So it's not a bad idea. I guess I worry about the accuracy of those and whether those would ultimately be useful for developers, because that's what it comes down to, right? Is the information is only as useful as it is accurate. So that's one thought. The other thought I have is that when we're thinking about costs, usually what I see states do is require utilities to publish. Sometimes they call them unit cost guides, or sort of a standardized cost for typical types of upgrades. To, I guess, continue the theme of looking at California, and I love the let's make Maryland the California of the Mid-Atlantic. I don't know. You all do have, the most aggressive GHG emissions reduction goals in the country, so it's not an unfair comparison. But anyway, what is done there is there's a unit cost guide that's available online, so developers can click a link and pull up a PDF that shows typical cost ranges. Ranges is important for typical equipment installed or required for typical upgrades. So those are kind of my rambling thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Jacob, you got any thoughts on that? Is it possible to get the information that's already available and any additional type stuff that folks are looking for, and kind of like a one-stop shop for the developers?
Yeah, it's something we can certainly take back. Obviously, as kind of referenced before, takes resources to make some of that stuff happen. So you would definitely have to understand what are the resources required to make that happen, and something to better understand of what's the value versus the cost of those kind of things. So it's something we can take back further. I think this discussion's been helpful understanding from Samantha, developer's perspective, and from OPC kind of, where they were coming from with the original comments.
Okay. All right. That's fair. Somebody just raised their hand. Thought so. All right. Maybe not. All right.
That was me.
Oh, there you go, sir.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I disappeared at the bottom of the screen. No, I just wanted to appreciate this discussion and refer back to the excellent technical presentations of whenever that was, seems 2 weeks ago. In the Berkeley Lab presentation, the very first presentation on DER planning and so on, the point was made, and I think we're actually doing a good job of it here, that the end users of this information that we're talking about, of the host capacity analysis and the availability of that information, are the DER developers. And so having as much of their perspective enter into the thinking, it's not so much that people are banging on the utilities because they're not doing enough, but rather the utilities with the developers have this partnership where seeing the developers as the end users of the information, all these considerations that are being brought forward to the extent that they can be implemented should be, because that's the purpose of the whole process in a way. And that was the point of the Berkeley Lab, one of the points of the Berkeley Lab presentation.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right. Anybody else? It's almost 12:30. I know I'd like to give everybody a break for lunch. And then we still need to talk about grid needs and locational value assessment comments that were filed there. Anybody want to hit on hosting capacity? I know we have got a lot of issues to follow up on. Yes, sir, Mr. Bartlett. Sir, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, it's okay.
I turned you off and I can turn you back on again. Yeah, just there was one piece of the joint utility comments that we hadn't gotten to, which is this paragraph about supporting the concept of a forward-looking hosting capacity. Actually, my question is really not so much about technical content as about this process of coordination between the interconnection working group and our working group. Make sure that one or the other, somewhere it gets dealt with, because the utilities are saying that they have advanced a forward-looking hosting capacity planning model called the Solar Ready Energy System in the interconnection working group, but the interconnection working group tells us that they're not actually the ones to be dealing with hosting capacity. So my question really would be, should we be looking at that Solar Energy Ready System proposal and in this working group and critiquing it? Because it seemed it's the kind of thing that could fall through the cracks if either we or they don't deal with it.
Right. No, I agree with you, and that'll be one of the first things I do as soon as I get off this call is coordinate with John. Is there anybody from the utilities that can speak a little bit to that program? At least give us an overview.
From the PHI side, the people that have kind of the more detailed info, I don't think are on this call.
Okay. All right. Yes, sir.
Judge, I'm obviously not with the utilities, but I have been pretty intimately involved in the interconnection work group. So happy to give just like a very high level overview. Obviously not familiar with specifically how the utilities are planning to go about it, but I think that's what this work group is here for in part. What was just approved in the RM81 rulemaking or hearing from the other day is that utilities are approved to move forward with what are called hosting capacity upgrade plans, which are proactive investments to upgrade the hosting capacity of the system in select areas based specifically on DER forecasts. So in other words, utilities determine that an area of their system based on a DER forecast is likely to, experience a lot of DER deployment in that select area. And so the idea is before there's a hosting capacity constraint to proactively upgrade the grid in that specific area to accommodate that future DER deployment. That's the general gist of the HCUP proposal. Anyone can feel free to recharacterize if folks feel like I missed that. But I think that the connection that John was bringing up, and sorry, I'm just pulling up his presentation on my end, between the DSP work group and the interconnection work group was there were 4 bullets that he listed of overlap. I think some or all of these apply. One is determination of hosting capacity available. So, developing a hosting capacity methodology is something that would obviously be a part of the determination of where the hosting capacity upgrade plans are going to go. We need to understand how hosting capacity is calculated. And so that's seemingly a directive to this work group. 2 is how DER forecasts are used in determining reserve hosting capacity. 3, how DER forecasts are used in right-sizing interconnection upgrades, which is part of MCAM. So maybe I'll leave that one alone for now. And then the 4th bullet point from John is how DER forecasts are used to determine areas of need in hosting capacity upgrade plan. So my understanding of where the overlap is between these work groups are effectively going to be, all right, now that we have the hosting capacity upgrade plan process approved via the regulations from the phase 5 report in RM81, now we need to figure out what the actual process looks like. The main points of that process are how is hosting capacity determined? What are the calculations? What is the approach? What is the methodology? And 2, what is the approach to developing DER forecasts and then using them to determine where the utilities are going to do their hosting capacity upgrade plans? That's my understanding of kind of where the commissioners directed this work group to play a role, and then that role will effectively inform the structure of the hosting capacity upgrade plan, which was approved in the other docket or in the other work group. Hopefully that overview is helpful for folks who were maybe less involved, but others can recharacterize if folks feel like I missed something there.
All right. Samantha and Mr. Cathan, I'm coming to you, but Ethan, did you want to comment on this? I saw your hand go up, sir.
Actually, I'm going to take 2 steps back to Tim posted the link to the Eversource. It turns out that their interconnection analysis portal leads to it is for DER developers to run individual projects on some level. There's a couple of PDFs worth of instructions. If Samantha or any DER developers could give us some feedback on how that Eversource system has worked for them, because it's not a hosted capacity map, or at least it's a part of a larger package. You know, I really, as a utility, we really can't evaluate another utility's process. Would like to hear from the developers what they thought of it. That would be very helpful for us, because this is a bit more far afield than just a hosting capacity map information upgrade that we were discussing.
All right. Thank you, sir. Samantha, you were next in line anyway. I know you didn't have your hand up for that.
Yeah, I can address that super quickly. I haven't clicked the link yet, so I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. But yeah, I know, I think it must be Massachusetts, where there are a whole bunch of different maps that utilities have to fulfill a whole bunch of different requirements. I do know that we regularly point to, you know, the Massachusetts hosting capacity maps as some of the most useful. But I will take a look and see what I mean by that. I have a link in my notes here somewhere, and I'll make sure it aligns with the one you've got. So yeah, let me figure that out in a minute. But the thing I wanted to just say quickly is that, you know, for this group's discussions moving forward, one of the things I think is helpful for us is to remember that there are at least 2 different use cases for hosting capacity that are relevant here. The first one is the one we've just spent a ton of time talking about, which is the hosting capacity maps themselves that show the hosting capacity analysis. They typically show, you know, distribution system infrastructure. Those are really helpful for the interconnection use case, meaning, you know, developers use them when they're trying to propose a spot to interconnect. The second use case that I think is going to be important for our next discussion on grid needs is using hosting capacity analysis to identify areas of the grid that will need to be upgraded in the future, you know, i.e. a grid need of capacity. And so that gets into the example of the DER ready or solar ready systems proposal, the hosting capacity upgrade plans, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to kind of call that out, that these are 2 different use cases or sort of applications of hosting capacity analysis that I think I bring that up because, you know, I recognize that this is a lot of analytical work on that utilities are being asked to do. And I think the work is different, right, for both of these use cases. In one of them, you know, we're asking you to publish a map. There are a bunch of concerns about cybersecurity and things like that. In the other one, we're asking you to do an analysis that's longer term looking. So I just wanted to make sure we're kind of talking about them separately as we go forward. That's all I was going to say. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Cathan.
So I want to bring up another consideration or a possible issue that needs to be addressed with associated hosting capacity analysis, and this relates to DER aggregation. So DER aggregation, you know, it will also impact and, you know, the ability of and amount of hosting capacity. So especially if a aggregation will operate a set of assets all, you know, in a different way than was initially expected as part of the original interconnection agreement, there needs to be some consideration that will have an impact, and it can be both positive and negative on amount of hosting capacity available. So I want to put that on the table, that, you know, as we go forward, and especially as, you know, as John was talking about, start considering the how to implement Order 2222 in Maryland, that we don't forget about some of these aspects of how aggregation will come in, and these will be started implemented in as of PJM's timetable in February 26th. This is a future, but not that far in the future, issue that needs to be addressed. And then the second point, and this is actually a third, you know, potential use case for why hosting capacity maps, especially good, accurate, and timely ones, it's also related to aggregation. In that, if the way aggregation works is that you will work with mostly customers who are already interconnected, or developments are already been interconnected. So the question then becomes, from an aggregator, which one do you select to put into your aggregation And you're not going to select ones that are in a portion of the grid that may be subject to frequent curtailment because it is a very tight and constrained area. So the hosting capacity analysis maps are, while not perfect, they are a useful tool to help, in for the aggregation. So just wanted to bring that in and have that part of the discussion.
All right. Thank you, sir. Anyone want to come? I got one more thing I want to touch base on. Yes, sir. Tim.
Really quick, just to echo and support David on his point that, yeah, we added actually a third use case for hosting capacity analysis, which is exactly this visibility and management of DER. So as hosting capacity analysis matures, it also becomes a bit of an operational tool as well.
Thanks, Tim. All right. Anybody else? I got just one last point before we head off to lunch. Dr. Bartlett had raised in his comments what he believed, or he termed an unnecessary reserve capacity as being a major obstacle in DER development. Wanted to know what the utilities' thoughts were on that, and I guess it really goes down to how you calculate the available hosting capacity.
Yeah, and I think this was discussed a little bit earlier when.
Okay. And if we did, I apologize if I missed it. So.
Yeah, it was when kind of Dr. Bartlett was talking with John with some of the questions. So I don't know if that part answered kind of your questions, Al, or if you had additional ones.
No, actually, thank you. I thought that discussion and the actions that have been taken or are being considered responded to the concern, as did the utilities comments in that regard as well. So yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, my apologies then. All right, Eli, before we break, can we quickly plan? Okay, Eli, you want to touch on the plan for the rest of the day?
Yeah, real quick. Judge, just wanted to remind you that we had scheduled kind of the first check-in of the metrics subgroup for the last hour of this call. So
Yes,
what is that, the 2 to 3 p.m. hour. Happy to modify that and maybe have us do that at the next session. Obviously, we're I don't know if we're necessarily done with the hosting capacity piece, and then we've also got the locational value assessment piece. And I think those are very cleanly under Jade boxes 5 and 6. So I think I would probably advocate for sticking with the overarching conversation and maybe pushing the subgroup convo till the last hour of the next one. Or I can do it on an ad hoc basis.
I mean, I wasn't planning on, the 2 to 3 o'clock, or, the meeting can go on as long as need be. So, and I wouldn't necessarily wasn't planning on attending the subgroup. I guess I can if you guys want me to.
No, I wasn't even asking you to attend this. I was mostly just in case there are. I don't know if there were going to be folks who were maybe like not on this call but intending to be on the subgroup call, and so maybe what I'll do is I will email everyone on that call and say we will potentially have this call depending on when the broader work group wraps its discussion, but we may push this. And if so, I'll follow up.
Sounds good. No, that's awesome. So yeah, so it's 12:42 now. Why don't we take a 45-minute break, and we'll come back at 1:30. We can, wrap up today's discussion of hosting capacity. I know there's a lot of things to follow up on. So we'll obviously be talking about this again, and then we'll get into grid needs and locational value assessment. All right.
Thanks, Judge.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you at 1:30.